Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Pursue the Hunt podcast channel today. And if you're watching, we're on the Pursue the Hunt live on our YouTube channel as well. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And before we get too much into it, just like to thank our sponsors, Peace Vale Meat Shop, and as well Eagle Vision Video Productions. So today we are going to be talking about spot and stalk strategies. And specifically, we're going to be talking about mule deer spot and stalk. So I'd like to just cover a little bit about that today. And just keeping it simple. And we're going to talk about agricultural fields, talk about coulees, and we're going to talk about tree stand hunting. So we'll be relating it to our ability to hunt mule deer in BC. So we're talking a little bit about bow season and rifle season, maybe some differences and some specifics when it comes to strategy to planning your hunt. So without further ado, let's get into it here. So the first one that we are going to talk about today is the agricultural location. So this would be if you're hunting mule deer in a field primarily. Of course, we want to make sure we have permission to hunt on that field. And so one of the most important things, regardless of location, weapon choice, clothing choice, spot and stalk strategy, all that kind of stuff, is making sure that you have scouted and or glassed previous to hunting. Mule deer like to travel, and so understanding mule deer patterns, getting out there a few weeks ahead of time to a specific spot is going to be really important. And so understanding what bucks are in the area, how many does are in the area, depending if you're hunting rut. For us, our bow season is well before rut in September, and so they'll have different feeding patterns. And they might be still in bachelor groups versus chasing does. So these are some of the things that come really handy when you're doing your scouting and your pre-work. And I've always been a man of the philosophy that if you put in the time before the hunt, the hunt is usually more enjoyable and it's also usually more successful. So put in your pre-work, get out there. If you have permission, walk the perimeter, especially if it borderlines a coulee or a creek. Find out where the trails are coming into the field, and get a lay of the land is really important. And then start getting out there early mornings and evenings, and just scout the area. Start counting animals. See if you can find different bucks in the area. Which ones are mature? Which ones are growers? And just kind of get the feel for it. All right. So getting into agricultural. So the first thing when I'm scouting and I'm doing my pre-work is looking at the different crop types of the land that I have permission to hunt on. And that's going to tell me a lot about the food source, which is going to tell me if it's an attractive food source. I know for up here, peas and canola seem to be a really good food of choice. Oats are good as well, but peas and canola seem to be the ones to pay attention to. So that's where I start. I talk to the farmers and I get a map of their land and what crops are in rotation where, and that's where I start beginning my pre scouting. So after that, once I've done my pre-scouting, I may put up some trail cameras. I'll definitely get boots on the ground to, again, if it borders a creek, I look for trails, I look for sun, I look for sheds, I look for scrapes. I look for all those things and start to gather information where they're coming out to feed. And that'll also give me an indication where they're going back to bed. And that way, if there's not an opportunity in the field, there may be one when they're bedded down. So sometimes they do bed in the fields. I've definitely had that happen. The Pope and Young mule deer I had shot a few years ago with my bow was bedded in a pea field. And so that was a difficult stalk, but yeah, middle of the day, bedded in the pea field. So definitely some stuff to pay attention to there. So the next most important thing, now we're kind of getting into the hunt, we're planning our stalk, is the wind. Okay, so whether you're bow hunting or rifle hunting, mule deer have excellent eyesight, they have excellent hearing, they have an excellent nose, they are wily. And so hunting mule deer is, yes, okay, there's a lot around. Oh man, it should be like shooting fish in a barrel. Well, it's not. And usually, if you're hunting early season for bow, they're going to still be probably in bachelor groups, which gives you more eyeballs to be looking out for danger, which makes even a spot and stalk that much more difficult in a field. But if you don't play the wind, then there's no point in going out, honestly. The wind, in my opinion, is the most important factor in a spot and stalk. And I will say that that's in line with any animal, mule deer, elk, moose, bear. If you're not going to play the wind carries sound and it carries scent. So if you look at the big ears and you look at that long snout, wind is playing a factor on multiple levels for their senses. So play the wind. And usually wind in a field rather than a coulee or mountainous areas, I have found in my experience to be more consistent. It's not swirling as much. It's usually just coming across the field. And so planning a spot and stalk when you're doing when you're playing the wind is a little bit easier, especially if you can spot the game further away, is just easier because the wind is more consistent. So you can then look at the landscape, plan your stalk, and always have a wind checker with you. I carry a wind chalk wind checker with me all the time. But usually, if you're looking at the weather forecast and you're on the ground and the wind is coming a certain direction, you can be pretty safe to say that the wind's not necessarily going to change direction as rapidly in a sense as it would in a swirling coulee or creek bottom or mountainous terrain. So always play the wind. So wind is number one. Okay, so along with clothing, it kind of goes across agricultural, coulees, tree stands. Clothing, you want to be able to move in it. You don't want to be restricted, especially if you're shooting a bow. Watch your angles when you're drawing your bow. Definitely practice drawing your bow beforehand with the clothing that you're going to be hunting in to make sure there's no restrictions there, because that is important when it comes time to send that arrow. So usually quiet. I've become a huge fan of merino wool. Is really nice and quiet. Also, thermoregulates really well. Soft shell is also really good. Rain gear, not so good. It's usually a little bit more crunchy. That being said, depends how much luck you have getting in on game. If it is raining, they might be holed up somewhere in the trees. So usually soft shell, merino wool is a much quieter, less crinkly option. And that kind of just goes across the board. So then for agriculture, we're going to look at bow stalk strategy. So for me, when I got my mule deer a couple years ago, so the story goes is opening day, September 1st, I had been scouting this bachelor group for probably 3, possibly even 4 weeks. I had a pretty good pattern on them, and I kind of knew their feeding patterns, and I spotted the group right away in the morning. They were actually in the ditch as I drove by them, and so they're quite used to vehicles, so I kind of just kept driving, got onto one of the access roads to the field, played the wind, got into my stalk position. I got within 30 yards of the group. They bedded on the field edge. The big one, which I had called the king, stood up. He was 5 on one, 3 on the other side, and I missed. And it was devastating, but thankfully I missed clean and saw him back out in that same area that evening. So the next morning, they were back in the pea field. They were kind of in the middle in a low spot where a slough had kind of dried up. There's lots of cattail in there. They're all kind of bedded in there, feeding around each other. Wasn't a great stalkable position, so I decided to back out and come back that afternoon, because chances are, they might move on. They might come back to that low spot because they seem really comfortable there. So I came back in the afternoon. It was mid-afternoon, about 3 p.m. And I just happened to see a pair of antlers just turn in the field and kind of buried my truck into the ditch behind a big willow patch there. And I was probably about 600-700 yards out, but he was buried in the pea field. He was bedded down, so I only saw antler tips, so he hadn't seen me. But now it was time to plan the stalk, and so I'll just kind of use this as my example, I guess. So the wind was basically moving cross direction from where I was and where he was bedded, which he was also about 300 yards past where I'd seen them that morning in that low spot. And I thought, well, it is risky, but if I slowly move my way through this pea field and get into that low spot, chances are when he gets up out of bed, he could feed right back into that low spot where they had been that morning. So I made my way into that pea field. I probably crawled on my hands and knees for a good 350 yards once I got to my spot through the peas, and I basically just hunkered into a set of dried out cattails and just waited there. Now the wind, like I said, thankfully it stayed consistent. It kept blowing basically crossways to where he was and I was, and basically I just needed to feed to me, and that was the hope, because it wasn't realistic for me to keep stalking through the peas and spook him either with sound or smell if that wind did change. So everything was in my favor. Sure enough, it was about an hour and 3/4 to 2 hours later when he actually got out of bed, and he started meandering to the low spot where I was. He kind of zigzagged away a little bit and started moving back in, and he took another probably 45 minutes to feed into me. And by this time, sun is starting to get a little bit lower, and he fed right into me. He actually got so close where I could actually hear the grass being ripped out of the ground. And he was just over 20 yards. When he buried his head into the grass, he couldn't see me because the grass was tall enough. So I thought, well, I'll draw as I'm kneeling, and he usually looks up to look around, and as soon as his head goes back down, I'm going to pop up and send it, which is exactly what happened. I drew, he looked up, looked around. As soon as I saw his head go back into the grass, I stood up and just hammered it. Hey guys, Mike here with Pursue the Hunt. Just tagged a real beauty northern British Columbia muley. As you can see, it's a really nice 4x4, really nice mass. Just a great hunt. Came in this afternoon. He was bedded in the peas and came with the wind kind of around him into this low spot, this kind of swampy spot in the middle of the field, and sat in the cattail till he got up and started feeding, and he fed right to me. Just want to thank everybody that was able to contribute this summer to helping me shoot better and learn some better scouting tactics. This guy here, what a beauty. Just a beautiful, typical, just really good mass right here. Carries right through into their beautiful velvet, wide, just inside his ears. Just a really, really nice buck. Sun is setting, so got a little bit of work to do to get this guy out of here. Wife should be showing up shortly with the side-by-side, but man, what a hunt. What a first beautiful mule buck. So it worked out really well, but had I not played the wind, it would have been game over. Had I not had the patience, it would have been game over. And so the stalk strategy with the bow is always stay low and go slow if you're hunting in a field. Ideally, if you can catch them while they're bedding, that's going to give you some more time. If they're feeding, you may have to stalk to intercept the direction that they're going. But low and slow will always give you the better opportunity. The quicker you move, the quicker they can pick up your movement, and usually you'll blow the stalk. And so that's number one is I always try to stay low, crouching or crawling, and I also just go slow, keep recalculating the wind, his position to my position, how the landscape is approaching, and all that kind of stuff. It just gives you more time to feedback, to keep planning your stalk as you go. So another thing that I use is sun position. So it happened to be that I was able to position myself. Basically, the sun was at my back, the deer was in front of me. And so, just like humans, animals don't typically look directly into the sunlight. And so, and if they do, it's hard to make things out because your pupils constrict, they let less light in, which makes it harder to focus. So if you can get the sun at your back by any means possible, if it's going down, usually you won't be in their line of sight very often because they won't purposely look into the sun. So that's just another tip there. And anytime you can, depending on how many mature bucks are in that bachelor group, or if it's just a single one, the one I was able to get, he actually singled himself away from the group, which makes the stalk much more easy when you only have one pair of eyes versus 5 or 6 pairs of eyes. So if you're able to stalk up on one that's maybe lagging behind in the group a little bit, chances are you'll have a little bit more success that way rather than trying to, sneak your way inside of a group. That would be extremely difficult. Maybe not impossible, depends how much you like a challenge. But definitely if there's a mature buck that's a little bit lagging behind, go for that one. Just a simple hunting strategy is not necessarily that he's weaker, but because there's less eyes on, it's going to make the angles of approach a little bit easier that way. Now, I keep using the word easy. I'm not saying that spot and stalk is easy. I'm just saying what might be easier than other approaches that way. Now, if you're rifle hunting, you still need to play the wind and the cover. It's still important. You still want to get close enough to make an ethical shot. So being mindful of that is important. Get as close as you can. But it does allow you a little bit more opportunity, not margin for error, but just opportunity in terms of maybe selection. If there's a bachelor group and you're comfortable shooting, 300 yards, you might be able to select deer out of that bachelor group rather than having to stalk in on a specific deer because of the situation of your weapon choice. And I've talked a lot to other colleagues and hunters about whether or not you remove your boots. Now, for the deer that I had missed on that opening day, I did remove my boots to close an extra, probably the last 30 to 40 yards. And the reason is because I was in the timber, they were on the field edge, and by September, if it's dry enough, there's old leaves, it's pretty loud. If you're on a game trail, it might not be as big a deal, but I wasn't able to be on a game trail, so there is a lot more twigs that could snap and things like that. And hard-soled boots versus soft-soled socks definitely do make a difference. Now, I did pick thorns out of my feet for like the next week, but it definitely was able to put me in a position where I could make a closer shot. So I'm not going to say yes or no, remove your boots. I definitely didn't for the one that I ended up shooting with my bow, just because it didn't warrant it. But play the situation, depending on environments that you're in, you might get away with it, you might not. So just be aware of your surroundings, of your environment, and you make the call, but it's not necessary all the time. Okay, so now we're gonna move over to hunting in the coulees. So with that, there's a lot more open plain, dealing with like grass coulees and creek ravines in maybe Alberta where it's a little flatter. In BC might be a little bit more timbered. I know some of the field edges that I hunt are definitely more open, south facing, but north facing they're quite heavily timbered. So you really got to play your environments, but we're going to kind of go on the fact that it's more grassy, less timbered, for today's reasons. Now, most feed that you're going to be looking at is going to be grass, and there's going to be more shade areas, which usually means you know more bedding opportunity for the deer. So that's definitely something to be aware of. Sagebrush, willow, things like that provide shade opportunity, wind blockage, would be good places to glass for sure. The wind definitely is going to make things a little bit more difficult on you. And the reason for that is because you're going to get, when that wind is coming out or going into that coulee and hitting all the different ridge lines, it's going to cause a bit of a swirling effect. And so playing the wind is really critical. However, usually on a field, it's fairly flat. There might be a few contours in there, but with a coulee, you're definitely looking at elevation. And so if you're near the top of the coulee, you're able to probably have a better vantage point, be able to glass more area perhaps. The negative on that, and that's one thing where you really want to pay attention on your stalk strategy, is keeping below skyline. And for those of you who don't know what skyline is, it's basically if you're on the bottom of a creek bed and you're looking up the hill and someone's walking right along the edge of the top of the coulee, they are skylining themselves to the sky, which is very easy then to pick out movement, to pick out the silhouette, etc. So keeping below skyline is super important. It's going to allow your camo to perhaps work a little bit better, but it's definitely for movement detection to keep below that skyline. Now, the cover, you're probably looking at thinner grass instead of like a thick crop, but you have more rolling hills. So there's different advantages to that. So rolling hills provide you to be below that skyline, especially if he's over on the other side of the ridge. You can stay completely out of sight. However, you also then lose sight of your prey as well. So that might be something to take in consideration, is to make sure if you are stalking like that and have a strategy where you are going up and over the hills and things like that, that perhaps the animal is bedded where you have a little bit more time. So if you do lose sight, you have an opportunity to regain that sight line instead of them feeding over the next ridge and the next ridge and, basically just disappears on you. So rolling hills can be definitely to your advantage, but also to your disadvantage depending on how you strategize your spot and stalk. Clothing remains the same. Something definitely movable and athletic. You might be doing more moving in a coulee versus in a field where, if it happens to be that the deer is feeding towards you, you can just hunker into a spot and wait that out. If you're in a coulee situation where it's a lot more spotty where the cover is in terms of the foliage, you may have to kind of jump from bush to bush to rolling hill and kind of play your cover a little bit more strategically that way. Now, stock strategy, again, keeping below skyline is super imperative. Playing the wind, so this is where a wind checker comes really, really handy. Make sure to check the wind constantly as it is swirling, especially as you start to close that last 100 yards. Really play the wind. This is where you may have to remove your boots to keep noise at an all-time minimum. If the wind is blowing pretty good in your favor, noise may not be as much of a factor, but if it's definitely just a breeze, you're going to want to take it slower and you're going to want to be as quiet as possible. Use the shadows, right? So sun usually provides glare, depending on what you're wearing. Even still, like sweaty skin can provide a shine, all that kind of stuff. So if you're able to be maybe on the more northward side and use the shadows to your advantage, usually there's more foliage on the north side, so that can help you as well. As long as you're playing the wind correctly. So there is the opportunity to use a bit more shadowing that way, just with the contour of the land. And it is ideal to stalk a deer in the coulee while it is bedded. And that's just for the simple fact that you know where it's positioned. So as you dip in and out of sight of that animal, that they're going to remain in that same position as to not disrupt your spot and stalk strategy. Okay. Moving right along here. So this is great. Remember, if you have any comments or questions, please drop them in the comments on our YouTube channel. We'll probably post this up on Facebook as well, so you can drop them in there. If you have any more spot and stalk questions, I'd love to hear from you. And just make sure you click that subscribe button or follow us on Facebook as well, as we always appreciate that as well. Okay, so we're going to move to the Treestand. So this one is a bit of a different animal, just in the sense of you are now stationary. Your ability to move is quite limited. However, if you've done your pre-homework, you could be in a very advantageous position. You're able to sneak into that spot much earlier than the game are moving. And so there's definitely advantages to hunting from a ground blind or a tree stand situation. Now, the direction facing the tree stand comes into play when you're setting your tree stand up. So what I normally do is I usually pay attention to the prevailing wind. And what I mean by that is when I'm setting my tree stand up in midsummer, I typically know that common wind directions in September for that area, or just in general, our whole area, south, southwest, and west. As we get later in the year, it starts transitioning into a northeast. That might be in the rut, but for September, we're still getting some warm winds. Typically, that south coming around to the west is usually where the wind is blowing. So I'll look for an opportunity to set my stand up to the north of the area that I'll be looking to shoot into. So like it could be a trail coming out of the creek bottom into the field, making sure that's to the south of me. So north is to my back, I'm facing south, so that the wind is either coming in my face or cross-directionally, but it's not blowing from behind me into the area that I'm shooting. So that's pretty critical. And so always pay attention to kind of where those common wind directions are for that time of year. And that can be a huge advantage when you're setting up the stand, so you're not having to move it close to hunting season, because animals will notice a new stand or a new blind in the area, but as it doesn't present any danger throughout the summer, they'll get accustomed to it. That's the hope. And so when it's time for you to sit in that blind, you know that you're already playing the wind because you planned it well ahead of time. Okay, so setup should be facing so that your face is in the wind for sure, and that the shooting lane, I usually like that shooting lane to be 30 yards or closer, because I'm usually bow hunting. And so setting that stand up to make sure that I can get a good clean shot away so my shooting lanes are clear of debris, and also that it's close enough, because if you've ever hunted mule deer, their ability to jump string is crazy. I can tell you, I've missed 3 mule deer because they've been able to jump my string inside of 30 yards. So learning how to use your pins on your bow is critically important, but setting your your stand or your blind up within that 30-yard range of where that trail's coming in out of the field or wherever you're setting it up gives you a much better opportunity to make that ethical shot. Yeah, so when you're shooting out of a ground blind, what we're doing there is, if you're shooting a bow out of a blind or a stand, then, your range is obviously limited. You're strategically placing that stand or blind by a trail that they use to come out of bed to feed and go back to bed, down in the coulee, things like that. So it's much more strategic when you're shooting a bow. However, when you're shooting a rifle, you have a lot more range to play with. And so, still playing the wind with the blind location, you can be a little bit further back from the entrance to the field where they're coming into, and it is going to give you more ability to scan the rest of the field and be able to reach out and touch game however far you're comfortable shooting, as long as that shooting lane is safe. So it is more strategic initially if you're shooting a bow, but you're still playing the wind, and so that's a critical thing. The other thing as far as clothing goes, actually, for tree stands, is that scent control could be a factor. Now, I say that because you're sitting in one place for long enough where if you're not getting much of a breeze to blow your scent completely out of the area, then it could be sitting or even possibly swirling around. So scent control, scent eliminator, odor eliminator clothing, things like that can definitely help keep that scent down if the wind isn't blowing hard enough to completely blow out that area. And that being said, it doesn't have to be a hard wind. But if it's a really calm day, you definitely want to be wary of how your scent is staying in that area. So, yeah, that's kind of the 3 I wanted to talk about. And just to kind of reiterate, keeping it simple. So, 1, know your location. Are you hunting in a field? Are you hunting in the hills? Or are you hunting out of a tree stand or blind? 2, wind direction, or even understanding the wind direction typically in that area for that time of season you'll be in that area is critically important. I can't stress that enough. Playing the wind is critically important. 3, what kind of cover do you have? Do you have hills? Do you have foliage? Is there glare from the sun? Know your cover. Look at the shadows. Look at the contour of the land. Use all of that inside your spot and stalk strategy. Clothing, anything soft shell. Merino wool is great, especially in the early season. Definitely thermoregulates really well. Avoid crinkly pants, windbreaker type of stuff. Rain gear, if it's raining, you be the judge. But anything less crinkly, crunchy is definitely to your advantage. And weapon choices. So if you're running a bow, know your distance that you're comfortable shooting in. Know more strategically where the game is coming in and out of that location, whether it be the field or the coulees. Pay attention to bedding areas. And with rifle, you still got to be comfortable shooting your weapon. It does allow you a little bit more flexibility, maybe to be more selective if it's a bachelor group rather than just a single deer. But shooting out of a stand or a blind definitely comes into more of an important role with your weapon choice. So I really hope you guys enjoyed listening to today's podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you hit that subscribe or follow us on our podcast. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Hit up our Instagram and Facebook page. and just follow us as we start getting into hunting season. We'll be dropping more tips. We're still prepping for our buffalo hunt, so we're going to be dropping some more stuff. With that, definitely getting out with the bow lots, getting really comfortable there. And yeah, spoiler alert, I'll be ordering some new gear tomorrow as far as clothing layers and stuff go. So we'll be looking at doing a little bit of reviews and why I chose certain layers. So yeah, covering today's topic, simple spot and stalk strategies. Keep it simple, stupid, right? Don't overcomplicate it, but don't undercomplicate it. Play the wind, know your location, know your cover, and remember your weapon choice. So yeah, thanks for listening and watching if you're watching this on YouTube, and we'll catch you later.